The Kellogg strike is over. It was announced on Tuesday that members voted to ratify the tentative agreement from the BCTGM press release. They highlighted the new 5-year collective bargaining agreement. There are no takeaways, no concessions. They say no permanent two-tier system, but the two-tier system is still in place. There is a more concrete path out of the lower tier, even though it is still there. A clear path, like they say, to regular full-time employment. This one is very important. A plant closing moratorium. There will be no plant shutdowns for the duration of this contract through October 2026. That's a big deal.
That is a big deal. Yeah, I'm glad to see that.
A significant increase in the pension multiplier and maintenance of cost of living raises. So, I mean, that's not bad. It's not all sunshine and roses, though, of course. Dave Jameson, he's a labor reporter for the Huffington Post. He spoke to Trevor Beidelman. He is the president of BCTGM Local 3G in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Dave said that Beidelman is disappointed in the contract to end the Kellogg strike. He says that the vote was close, although he didn't have the exact numbers, and that he thought Kellogg's threat to permanently replace striking workers turned a lot of votes, which is why it's so important that we that we make it illegal to hire permanent replacements, that we make it illegal to fire workers for striking. And that was, of course, the original intention of the National Labor Relations Act, but over the course of the decades, as the class war from above has continued and bosses have continued to attack organized labor, there were people that were appointed by anti-worker forces on the National Labor Relations Board that construed a right to hire permanent replacements out of thin air. I mean, it was because in the National Labor Relations Act itself, it says nothing in this act shall be, I mean, for one, it explicitly makes firing workers for striking illegal. It's illegal to fire people who strike, okay? But they created this fiction that somehow permanently replacing somebody while they are on strike is different, and that's legal. And Jennifer Abruzzo, who is the new NLRB, National Labor Relations Board General Counsel, appointed by President Biden, she said she has released a press statement on this, saying that she quoted the National Labor Relations Act, where it says that nothing in this act shall be construed as negating the right of working people to strike, or something like that. That's a paraphrase, but it was something like that. I mean, it was the language of the NLRA is very clear, and so she is actually basically petitioning unions to challenge that permanent replacement doctrine now, which is very good. But in the meantime, Congress can always go ahead and pass a law that says that's illegal. Of course, the NLRB should reverse its stance on permanent replacements, but Congress can always be proactive, and we have seen the results of not being proactive on the part of Congress because, of course, the Supreme Court in 1970 ruled that women have the constitutional right to choose what happens to their bodies, and now that right is at stake. And how many years have Democrats had a trifecta government since 1970? How many years have Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency without passing a law that codified Roe versus Wade? I mean, years have gone by without that happening. And now Roe v. Wade could very well be overturned without a federal law in its place to protect women's right to choose. So, that's an illustration of how important it is that lawmakers are actually proactive on these things, where the law is even remotely, of course the law is not actually, muddled or not clear. The law is clear, but we can make it more clear.
Yeah, and employers are always going to take any sort of wiggle room they can find. Right. And if they can get away with it, they will do it, and they will keep doing it. And,
right.
That is such a big piece of leverage, the ability to talk to a workforce and threaten them. Right. That, hey, if you guys go out on strike, we are going to replace you. You won't, it won't matter what kind of, proposals you have, because there won't be a job for you.
Yeah.
That is such a big piece of leverage. I think one thing we've seen in this year is a little bit of the shift in the labor market, and I think that maybe that sort of leverage has decreased recently. But, as we see here, straight from the Kellogg strike, it's still a factor, and it's still impacting people's ability to hold the line and negotiate the kind of agreement they really believe is fair.
Right. WWMT Channel 3 in Michigan talked to some members who felt similarly unhappy. They derided the retention of the two-tier system of employment, which is, of course, terrible. They were saying that is a way to divide and conquer, which is true. Right. That's why it was invented. It was invented to get a bad contract for new members in, while still retaining benefits for people who have been working there for a while, to try to ease in these concessions and, stealing more from working people, stealing more of the value that they create for the company for themselves to fill the pockets of these people at the top. Connor Lewis, he's a member of the labor journalism collective Strike Wave, which everybody should check out. It is thestrikewave.com. He had a good analysis of the conclusion of the strike on Twitter. It seemed to me that he struck a good balance. That the result of the strike was not necessarily a slam dunk, but it's clearly a better contract than they would have gotten if they hadn't struck. Strikes work, but they don't necessarily work miracles, as he said. And but breaking the endless cycle of concessionary bargaining is a big deal. Yes, the fact that this contract did not have any new concessions in a manufacturer, like these are just manufacturing workers, right? I mean, just manufacturing workers. That's not the right phrase, but still, the manufacturing workers have for decades and decades only been able to defend themselves against attacks by the employer. They have only been able to retain, and they have taken contracts back to the members and said, we only lost this much this year. We only lost this much this year, right, as opposed to how much they wanted to take from us. That every single contract, basically since 1980, has been that way, especially in the manufacturing sector. And so with this strike, like in so many other strikes that we've seen this year, that endless cycle of concessionary bargaining has been defeated. And that's a big deal. They didn't get everything that they wanted, and it's very difficult to turn everything around, years and decades of concessionary bargaining, in one contract cycle. Right. So he said, he concluded that whether or not this is a big victory is going to be measured in large part on what happens in the next contract. Do the members of this union take heart in what they've won and use the next 5 years, which 5 years is a very long time for a contract cycle. Connor mentions, he has mentioned in some of his other writing, that maybe instead of kind of fetishizing the removal of the no strike clause, we can talk about other things that are easier to put in contracts, like having shorter contract cycles to increase militancy, as opposed to immediately going for the no strike clause, which would be great. Contracts shouldn't have no strike clauses, but it's going to be a lot easier to get a boss to agree to a 3-year contract or a 2-year contract or a 1-year contract than it is to get them to take, than it would be to get them to take no strike clauses out, which are also no strike, no lockout clauses. So, that's worth noting as well. But, are they gonna take these 5 years to work towards, to plan on striking again, or to plan on making a credible strike threat so that they can win more in 2026? Or are they going to kind of sit back and not prepare and just let let things happen to them and, not kind of, it's up to the members. It's up to the union what happens in 2026, and whether or not this is a big victory is like Connor said, it's gonna be dependent on what happens in 2026. So.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with that, and I like the way Connor phrased that, because one of the most essential rules of organizing is always be organizing. You cannot rest on one contract or one victory or one defeat, frankly. So I think that's a very good way of looking at it. We can't really judge the success or failure of a contract in isolation. You have to see the trends, and as you mentioned, so many of us, regardless of industry, have been in this defensive posture for decades now.
Right.
And we can't expect one strike or even one strike wave to undo decades of globalization and outsourcing and neoliberal policies. That's not very realistic in terms of one particular labor action. But what I saw was a moratorium on plant closings. Mm-hmm. That's big. And I think that's where you can start to build momentum for the future. So I really hope that's what we see. And like you said, now we have a few years. So hopefully the Kellogg workers will build on the relationships they forged here, build on the experiences they've had. They know some of what works. They know some of what didn't work. So hopefully they're going to move in much, much stronger to enforce this contract, to hold Kellogg's accountable, and to build to something even better in the future.
Right, exactly.
Support for the Valley Labor Report comes from the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers Union. Learn more by visiting www.ifpte.org.